Hello?
Welcome.
This is the two cities.
Oh, I'm so excited.
Being sick is one of the most vulnerable positions to be in. Disease and illness can remove our autonomy and independence. Being hospitalized or in need of home care means relying on another to survive. We put a lot of trust in healthcare workers, such as doctors and nurses. Doctors take the Hippocratic Oath, promising to utterly reject harm and mischief, prioritizing the health of their patients. But what happens when a caretaker is not quite right? Stephen King once wrote a novel about this instance. It's one of my favorites. Misery tells the story of Annie Wilkes, a nurse who finds her favorite author, Paul Sheldon, in need of help. She takes him to her home to nurse him back to health, keeping him captive until he finishes his book, reviving her favorite character. She demands a happy ending. Having fallen in love with Paul, she explodes into a psychotic rage when he refuses her advances, attacking him and hobbling him. The story is terrifying, not because of some supernatural experience or insane circumstance that Stephen King is known for, but because Paul is vulnerable and in need of help and compassion. But Annie's incapable of helping him. Annie's determined to use Paul for her own benefit. The true horror lies in that vulnerability, the reality that it could happen to any of us. In 1954, Honora Kelly was born to Irish immigrants. Her mother, Bridget Kelly, died of tuberculosis when she was young. This left Honora with her father, a well-known alcoholic known as Kelly the Crack, for his abusive and erratic behavior. He was the source of many rumors of his own insanity, including a story about him sewing his eyelids closed while working as a tailor. Just a few years after his wife's death, he took his two young daughters, 8-year-old Delia and 6-year-old Honora, to the Boston Female Asylum. Kelly the Crack was believed to have been abusing the girls, so the asylum was likely the best option for them. An orphanage for indignant female children, the asylum intended to find the girls respectable families. Kelly the Crack never returned for his girls. Records indicate that the girls were, quote, rescued from a very miserable home. There were no other records of Honora's time at the asylum. Delia became a sex worker, and her older sister Nellie, not committed to the orphanage, was later committed to a different asylum. But in November 1864, less than 2 years after her father had left her, Honora was placed as an indentured servant in the Topin home in Lowell, Massachusetts. Typically, indentured servitude was used for people paying for their travel to the New World by working for an employer for a number of years. But for Honora, it worked more as an adoption. While never formally adopted, she did take the surname Topin. Mrs. Anne C. Topin passed her off as an Italian girl whose parents died at sea because there was such an intense cultural stigma surrounding the Irish. Honora did well in school and had many friends, but she gained weight and was deemed unattractively fat. She began telling outrageous lies, like her father sailed around the world and her sister married an English nobleman, or her brother was honored at Gettysburg by Abraham Lincoln. This type of lying is a trademark of a sociopath. At 18, she graduated from Lowell High School, and the Topins freed her from her indentured servitude. She was given $50, but she stayed in the house as a servant. And when Anne died, Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, took over the home and continued treating Honora, now known as Jane, as her servant, though kinder than her mother had. Topin began to take an interest in healthcare and started her training in nursing in 1885 at Cambridge Hospital. She was well liked in the program and had many friends. She was described as brilliant and friendly. She earned the nickname Jolly Jane because of her bright and helpful disposition. She fostered close relationships with her patients and picked her favorites. These patients were particularly vulnerable as they were typically elderly and very ill, but the hospital staff grew deeply concerned about her obsession with autopsies. There was a dark side to Jolly Jane. She often used her patients as guinea pigs, conducting experiments on them. She would alter their prescribed dosages of morphine and atropine to see what it did to their nervous systems. She became intensely attached to them and spent hours alone with them, making up fake charts and medicating them to drift in and out of consciousness. At times, she would get into bed with them. In 1887, Amelia Finney had an operation. Afterward, she claimed Jolly Jane gave her a dose of bitter medicine and she lost her consciousness. Jane then climbed into bed and began kissing all over her face. Something startled her and she stopped. The next morning, Finney decided it had all been a dream. But 14 years later, when Topin was arrested, she realized that it wasn't. She went undetected and was recommended for a prestigious position at Massachusetts General Hospital in 1889. She continued her work and claimed victims there before being fired the following year. She returned to Cambridge but was dismissed for administering opiates recklessly to her patients. This led to her career as a private nurse. She launched her career despite claims of theft and continued to poison her patients. Outside of work, she told obscene jokes, gossiped, drank constantly, and turned friends against each other. She told her colleagues in nursing school that there was no point in keeping old people alive. She befriended her landlord and his wife, but decided that they were feeble and fussy, and in 1895, she killed them. She killed Mary McLear after being hired to care for her, and a month later, she killed a friend so that she could take her job at the theological school. Elizabeth, her foster sister, often invited her to come and stay at the home she grew up in. In 1889, she was with Elizabeth when Elizabeth complained of depression. Jane took her to the Cape for a picnic and put a dose of strychnine into her mineral water. She later explained, quote, "I held her in my arms and watched with delight as she gasped out her life." But Jane wasn't stopped. She moved on to Elizabeth's husband, Ormel. Within 3 days, she killed the housekeeper and took over in an attempt to oppress Ormel. He made it clear that he didn't want a housekeeper or a new wife. She decided to win him over by poisoning him to nurse him back to health. And when that didn't work, she threatened to claim he'd gotten her pregnant, so he ordered her out of the house. She then tried to commit suicide with an overdose of morphine, but failed. In 1901, she moved in with Alden Davis, an elderly man. His wife had just passed at the hands of Jolly Jane, and within weeks, he too was dead. She also killed Genevieve, his sister, and 2 of his daughters, Minnie and Edna. But this was the end of the train. The surviving members of the family were suspicious of Jane and ordered a toxicology exam on Alden's youngest daughter, Minnie. The report found that she was poisoned, and Topin was the main subject. After 6 years of her practicing medicine, Jolly Jane was arrested on October 29, 1901, and by 1902, she'd confessed to 31 murders. She claimed to have started her killing spree when a boyfriend dumped her when she was 16. She said that she had been offered a promise ring, but he moved and fell for someone else. She said, quote, "If I had been a married woman, I probably would not have killed all of those people. I would have had my husband, my children, and my home to take up my mind." The New York Journal reported her confession, in which she explained that she wanted to be found insane so that she could eventually have the chance to be released. She insisted she was sane while in court and argued that she could not be insane if she was aware of what she was doing, recognizing that it was wrong. But she was declared insane and committed for life at the Towton Insane Hospital. Shortly after her arrest, the Hoosier State Chronicles reported that Topin had fondled her victims as they died. She also was said to have tried to see their inner workings of their souls through their eyes. When questioned after her arrest, she said that she was sexually aroused as patients neared death, came back to life, and then died. She would administer her mixture of drugs and lie with her patients as they passed. She's quoted to have said that her ambition was to have killed more people, helpless people, than any other man or woman who ever lived. She's noted as an angel of death, a serial killer who has a caretaker role and attacks those who are vulnerable and dependent. But she also killed for personal motivation, such as the instance of killing her foster sister of whom she was jealous. But she didn't just murder people, she also drugged people for personal gain, such as a housekeeper so that she could take her job, or men who she was courting. She was like many serial killers. She had an unstable childhood, but was unlike most female serial killers in that she did it for a sexual thrill. Honora Kelly, Jane Topin, Jolly Jane, died on October 29, 1938. Jolly Jane was anything but jolly with her patients. She preyed on the frail and weak. It's truly frightening to think about those who take advantage of that vulnerability. Like Annie Wilkes, Jolly Jane made sure to keep her patients from healing, instead preferring to watch them suffer. Thanks for tuning in to our March Marathon, dedicated to National Women's Month. We have more to come, some creepy, like Jolly Jane, some strange, but all of these women are for sure badass. And one last thing, we love hearing from you. Emails and comments are awesome, but rating and reviews are really important too. So subscribe, rate, review, and keep tuning in for more Tales from Two Cities. Until next time.